Hey everyone, it's time again to recap the latest news from the solar PV industry, compiled by the American Solar Energy Society. I'm Jay Warmke with SolarPVTraining.com, and this is what's happening in the wonderful world of solar for the week of February 16th. Well, this week's news is definitely a case of good news and bad news. So let's hit the good news first. The share of utility scale solar in the U.S. power generation mix will grow from 5% in 2024 to 7% this year and increase to 8% next year. This according to a forecast by the U.S. Energy Administration, or EIA. This represents a 45% increase in the amount of U.S. solar generating capacity between 2024 and 2026. Conversely, the share of natural gas-fired generation is projected to fall from 43% last year to 40% this year and down to 39% of the mix next year. Wind will stay relatively flat at about 11%, but then grow to about 12% in 2026, according to these projections. And coal also will remain relatively unchanged at 16% of the U.S. generation mix. The trend continues. Non-fossil fuel generating sources are expected to overtake fossil fuel generating sources within the U.S. electrical grid by 2030. On a related note, EIA is projecting the U.S. energy-related CO2 emissions will actually increase 1% this year, but then next year will fall to pre-2024 levels. In 2024, electric generation in the U.S. Power sector grew by 3% to meet the growing electrical demand from AI, from data centers, and from the electrification of vehicles. EIA expects U.S. power plants to generate about 4,240 kilowatt hours of electricity. I think that's megawatt hours of electricity in 2025, up 2% from 2024, with growth of another 1% in 2026. Now, if this does indeed happen, this will mark the first time we've had 3 years of electrical growth in generating capacity since 2005 through 2007. Texas is a good example of this growth trend. Historically, ERCOT, which manages 90% of the Texas power load, has primarily relied on natural gas for its power, but other energy sources like wind and solar have been there to meet peak demand. The energy mix is changing and changing quickly. In fact, in recent years, Texas has surpassed California as the nation's leader in renewable energy installations. While ERCOT did add 3,400 megawatts from natural gas power plants in 2024, they also added 4,000 megawatts of battery storage capacity, and the capacity from solar grew by about 9,700 megawatts. Wind generation in Texas grew last year by 13,000 megawatts. In other words, in 2024, over 89% of all new generating capacity added to the Texas grid came from renewable sources. This continues a trend that over the last 15 to 20 years, generation from fossil fuel sources such as coal and natural gas have remained relatively stable, while nearly all of the growth in generating capacity has been from renewable sources. As a result, in 2024, nearly 48% of all power used within the Lone Star State came from non-carbon sources. Several weeks and 2 separate federal court orders later, state agencies and their beneficiaries are still not able to access billions of dollars from federal grants for renewable energy projects, which is why 23 Democratic attorneys general are suing the Trump administration and asking a federal judge in Rhode Island to intervene. The motion filed last Friday asks Chief Judge John McConnell Jr. For emergency and immediate enforcement of his existing order blocking a federal funding freeze. McConnell issued the temporary restraining order on January 31st, preventing Trump and other federal cabinet heads from blocking access to funds until further notice. But according to the lawsuit, This restraining order has largely been ignored, and state agencies still remain locked out of the payment systems and other portals that control billions in federal funding. The Attorney General's filing states in part that there has been an ever-changing kaleidoscope of federal financial assistance that has been suspended, deleted, in transit, under review, and more since entry of the order. These conditions persist today. In court documents submitted on February 3rd, Daniel Shui, the U.S. Department of Justice's attorney representing the Trump administration, wrote that the administration did not interpret that the temporary restraining order applied to Trump's executive orders. Shui also indicated that the administration does not feel that the federal funds allocated through Biden-era programs under the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Improvement and Jobs Act were subject to this court order. So the lawsuits continue. Last week, a federal judge in D.C. issued a temporary restraining order blocking the funding freeze in response to separate lawsuits by nonprofit and business groups. And also last week, the state of Pennsylvania filed a lawsuit claiming federal agencies were unlawfully restricting Pennsylvania agencies from accessing over $3 billion in funding for programs like Solar for All and greenhouse gas emission mitigation. And the already glacial permitting process for large renewable energy projects just got a little bit slower, according to the American Clean Power Association. President Trump's day one executive order putting a 60-day freeze on final decisions from the renewable energy projects on federal lands has also ground key permitting work in government offices responsible for wetland and species protection. The ACP's memo, which was dated February 3rd, states that companies are now facing major challenges in getting sign-offs and guidance from the Army Corps of Engineers, which handles the wetland permits. Now, federal environmental protection law requires that these large construction projects, even on state and private land, must get direction from federal agencies before they can begin to build these projects. Wetlands permitting has long been the job of the Army Corps, which determines whether the area is subject to the Clean Water Act. At least 2 districts within the Army Corps of Engineers have indicated that wind and solar projects will not be issued any jurisdictional determinations. These are known as JDs. Usually renewable developers get a simple go-ahead from the Army Corps saying that they don't have any wetlands or bird nest sites on their project's location, and then they can begin the work. But according to the Army Corps, receiving a JD is now considered optional. However, developers fear that if they proceed without it, then they're going to be subject to further delays in the permitting process. Additionally, staffing for the Army Corps is uncertain due to questions over whether the money from the Inflation Reduction Act, which provided funds for permitting personnel, will be available to continue to fund these positions. And that's the news from the solar industry for this week. We'll see you next week.